Welcome to SideGig at the University of Pennsylvania. We're recording here in the beautiful Kelly Writer's house. And SideGig is the show where I, Kevin Platt from the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach, and my friend
Paul Saint-Amour from the English department here at Penn,
talk with interesting people who are on campus already or who come to campus and make music with them.
Emily Wilson is on campus already. She is our friend and colleague. She is a classicist, scholar, translator. She did a translation, a now very celebrated translation of Homer's Odyssey in 2018, from which she's going to be reading today in both the ancient Greek and the English, and has just followed that up with a translation of Homer's Iliad, which is magnificent.
And she is also a noted scholar, a specialist in ancient Greek tragedy and in epic poetry, as well as in ancient philosophy. So we're so happy that you could join us, Emily.
Welcome, Emily.
Thank you for having me.
Would you be willing to talk, as a way of sort of setting up what we're going to perform, talk a little bit about what this passage in Book 8 is, what happens leading up to it, and what it in turn is kind of queuing up in the narrative? Because it's right before a big reveal, isn't it?
It's right before a big reveal. So this is a passage from the Odyssey. It may be paradoxical that the only moment in the Homeric poems in which we get the wooden horse is not the Iliad, the poem about Troy, but the Odyssey, the poem which takes place 10 years later. And it's Odysseus begs the poet/singer, the Aioidos, at the court of the Phaeacians, where he's having a layover on the way during his many stops journey back to Ithaca. And he specifically requests the story of the wooden horse, which of course is his own greatest triumph. It's through the wooden horse that he manages to be the city sacker, as he's described in the beginning of the Odyssey, the sacker of Troy and many other cities. So he asks for this poem, or this section of the famous deeds of men, heroic stories, and Demodocus sings it and describes how the Trojans had this debate about whether or not to take the horse into Troy. They take it in, and of course that means their ruin. And then I think it's interesting both because it's an inset song, it's one of several inset songs, but then it also has this sort of pairing of the story of the wooden horse presented both as a great triumph in the story of Demodocus, and then within Odysseus' reaction, it's presented from the other point of view of what does this mean for nameless men and women who get either slaughtered or enslaved as a result of this great triumph, which is a triumph for some people and a huge loss or of either freedom or life or their home for a lot of other people. And so I think it's also interesting in that it sort of juxtaposes two very different kinds of songs, both the explicit inset song of Demodocus and then the narrator's different way of singing this song. And sort of question of which song belongs to Odysseus. Is he crying with his own victims? Is he traumatized by what he's done? But then what does it mean for the person who's perpetrated this violence to be also having an experience which is equated in some way with his victims? But then I didn't answer about the big reveal. So then he's going to tell his own story. So then after Odysseus responds in this way to the songs of the professional poet, he then becomes the poet himself, telling the tall tales of his own adventures to the Phaeacians. Hus fatho dorme theis theu ercator, faina da oiden, en thehelon hus hoimena usel mona pineon, bantes a pepleon, pur den clissioisi balontes arge oi, toi deda aga cluton ampha desea, herte enitroon agare cagalumeno hippo. Autoi gar min troes es acropoliner santo, hus homen este que, toi dacreta polla goriuen, hemonoi amfauton, tricades visin hender of bule, diaplexai coi londrunele et calco, cata patroun balaen erusantes ebacres, an megal galmathaun, tel cetrionenai, te per de caiapeta, tele juices thy emelon. Aisa garena po lesthai a Penn, polis amphicalypse, dorate on megan hippon, hoth eata pantas arestoi, arge untruessi phonon, kai cera phonontes. Dentus a studia prathen huias a caun, hippothen encumenoi, coi lon locon ec prole lipontes. Alon dalle aide polon cara isdemen aipan, autor Odyssey se pro portidomata dei foboio bermanai, euta area, sun antiphonomena lau, Kethi de ainotaton polamon, fata de tolme santa, nike sai kai apeta diab megathumon athenan. Tau tara oidos aeda paruklotos. Autor Odysseus teketo, dacrudet de duen hupo bleferoisi pareias. Hus de gune claesi filon posin amphe pesusa, hostes proste poliosna un te possessin, aste eid kai te kessid amumu nele es hema. Hemen tonthne sconta, kai asperonta edusa, amfau tu cumane liga cuque. Hoi darapuste, copten tes, dora essi metafronon, ede kai umus, ere ron eisagagusa, ponon decamen kai oudstone. Tes de lele o nototu aka flinuthusa pareiai. Hos Odysseus ala einan ofrusi dacron eben.
Have you ever like chanted to like musical accompaniment before?
No, this is my first time, so I'm a little nervous about it. Yes.
What did you think?
I liked it. I thought it was good. I felt like I was starting to hear it better. Yes.
Is this what you do in class?
I mean, I do reading, but I don't make people bring their guitars. So
maybe you should make your students bring their
I
guitars.
should. Yes.
I think Homer to a ukulele choir is probably the maneuver.
So how many strings does that have? Because the classical one had 7.
7 is the classical lyre?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm down a string.
Right.
I don't know.
And then in the late 5th century, the quote-unquote new music, sort of innovative poets in the late 5th century introduced more strings. So they had like 11-string lyres for these very complicated melodies. Not for Homer, but for
numbers.
The magic of it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that it's more in touch with the gods, right?
I guess.
That's why we're playing in 5/4.
Exactly. And that's why we're playing somewhat
Incantation.
dissonantly. So how is it that you imagine I always imagine the bard with their own lyre?
Yes,
But
I mean
is that
that's
how it works, or do you think that it's there's a bardic singer with an accompaniment? Is that ever the case in this ancient, or do we know?
I mean, the thing is, we really don't know. What we know is, of course, scenes like this. I mean, the Odyssey has multiple scenes like this. I mean, both primarily in Book 8, where Demodocus has these 3 set-piece songs, but then there's also the singer back in Ithaca in Odysseus' court, and they use a lyre and accompany themselves. And so if you think that's a sort of realistic depiction of the norms, then maybe it's that. I mean, so much of our evidence is either internal to the Homeric poems themselves. So what does that tell us about how were these poems actually performed later? So we know that they were also performed at civic and religious festivals. And so you might think maybe the festival version, maybe it had more performers. But we also have the much later evidence of Plato's Ion, which is a dialogue with Socrates interrogating a Homer performer, a rhapsode. And sort of Ion claims, I mean, it's sort of one of those classic Socrates showing that people who think they know something know nothing. Ion thinks he knows everything because he knows Homer and he can perform the Homeric poems. So that must mean that he knows everything, not just about music and poetry, but also everything about, generalship and strategy and cooking, because those things come up in Homer, and of course he doesn't know anything. But I think that those kinds of pieces of evidence suggest it's about individuals performing these multi-voice texts, but presumably sometimes putting on different voices and changing up the music depending on the scene.
So as someone who translates, I think a lot about when I'm co-performing translations with a living poet. I usually translate living poets, and I think I modify my production when I'm performing with someone to try and somehow do something to bring myself closer to their voice. But there is this strange thing. It's your voice, their poetry, or your translation, their poetry, but you're somehow their voice. But how do you think about your voice in relation to Homer or Homer performers? How you don't have the luxury of hearing them.
I can't hear them. I mean, I can read them and hear them by reading them out loud or by listening to other people read them out loud. I think about it primarily not that I've actually heard real life Homer, but that I have read both Homeric poems and also other bits of ancient Greek. And so I can sort of think about how does Homeric poetry read differently or sound differently if a modern person reads it out loud versus how does Sophocles sound or versus how does Pindar sound, and the sort of differences in the poetics in the original. I can think about that, but it's not that it's actually the same as having a soundtrack.
Do we know whether it's typical for there to be a performance of the entire, epic, or just doing bits of it? I want my favorite bits of it.
I would guess that a lot of the time they were my favorite bits, because the whole thing. The audiobook of my Iliad takes over 20 hours. It just kind of it's a long haul thing.
A whole weekend to do.
The whole weekend. We also know that at the Great Dionysia, where they had 3 days of dramatic festivals, they did 4 plays back to back. So that was a whole day enterprise starting at dawn. So if you want something equivalent to whatever the length of 4 plays is, maybe you're going to do a third of the Iliad, but you're not going to do even that. It would be too long to do the whole thing.
Presumably for one singer and one performer,
it would be exhausting too.
Yeah,
absolutely
it's it's kind of like a crazy marathon of performance.
Yes, so when Milman Parry did his trips to the former Yugoslavia, there were celebrity singers who were able to go for hours and hours singing their versions of these various oral and oral-ish epics, but still 20 hours is pushing it. People have theorized maybe it was done in sort of 3 segments sometimes if it was a festival performance. But I would guess that there were also much shorter bits. So for instance, within the catalogue of ships, there's a lot of debate about why is there so much about the Boeotians, even though the Boeotians play almost no part in the Iliad at all. Presumably, one possible answer is local requests, right? If you have an audience of visiting Boeotians, then you want to have a bit from Homer that we're going to have that bit. Yeah. Or if you want, something to entertain, people who are interested in debate or argument, we have a council scene meeting, or whatever it might be, something suitable for a feast. You're going to have a banquet scene. A god inspired the bard to sing. He started with how the Greeks set fire to their camp, and then embarked and sailed away. Meanwhile, Odysseus brought in a gang of men into the heart of Troy, inside the horse. The Trojans pulled the thing up to the summit and sat around discussing what to do. Some said, we ought to strike the wood with swords. Others said, drag it higher up and hurl it down from the rocks. But some said they should leave it to pacify the gods. So it would be. The town was doomed to ruin when it took that horse, chock full of fighters bringing death to Trojans. And he sang how the Achaeans poured from the horse, in ambush from the hollow, and sacked the city, how they scattered out, destroying every neighborhood. Like Ares, Odysseus with Menelaus rushed to find Deiphobus' house. And there he won at last, through dreadful violence, thanks to Athena. So the poet sang. Odysseus was melting into tears. His cheeks were wet with weeping, as a woman weeps as she falls to wrap her arms around her husband, fallen, fighting for his home and children. She is watching as he gasps and dies. She shrieks a clear, high wail, collapsing upon his corpse. The men are right behind. They hit her shoulders with their spears and lead her to slavery, hard labor, and a life of pain. Her face is marked with her despair. In that same desperate way, Odysseus was crying.
Emily, you were talking about evidence internal to the text, about the music. What about evidence internal to the text vis-a-vis figures within the world of the epics who are kind of translator-like figures? I mean, did you feel sort of accompanied or instructed by any, the Tiresias or Demodocus or Odysseus himself in the task of the translator as it's sort of understood internal to the text?
Yeah, I mean, so I thought a lot about sort of thinking through the voice of the narrator, as well as the voice of the various characters. I mean, with the Iliad, with both the Iliad and the Odyssey, there were messenger characters. I mean, there's Hermes who passes through different worlds in the Odyssey. There's Iris, the rainbow goddess, in the Iliad, who's a great character and sort of has to try and convert messages for different audiences who don't necessarily want to hear what's being said. And sort of thinking through how is a translator rainbow coloured was sort of interesting to me. I mean, I also thought part of the job is not just to sort of fixate on some of the characters, because, of course, I have to do the whole thing. I mean, I have to find voices for all of them, not just the ones that might relate to what I'm doing. But yes, I thought about the characters who are particularly sort of thinking about language in really explicit ways, which is usually the messengers.
When we were discussing what you were going to read today, you were saying that the end of this passage is very intense because of that simile with where Odysseus is in his weeping is likened to the woman whose husband has been killed in battle and who's going to be taken and enslaved along with her children. And it really, that moment, it feels as if the comparand, or however we think of her, kind of threatens to overwhelm Odysseus. I mean, there's that it is so vivid and painful and traumatic in a different way. And I think the way you read it really captures that powerfully. Is there more to say about that moment? Is that a singular moment in the poem? Or are there other moments when a victor is likened to a perpetrator in that really vexing manner?
I mean, I think this is a in some ways unique moment, but I think it's also it's been discussed in terms of a sort of set of what Helena Foley has called reverse similes, where you think of it, you think you're identifying with one perspective, and then it flips around, you're identifying with another. You think you're from a male perspective, and now you're from a female perspective. I mean, so another sort of possible passage to put, a couple of passages one could put next to it. One is when Odysseus is in disguise talking to Penelope, and it sort of seems as if she's partly intuiting who he is, but maybe doesn't quite get it, and then she's melting like a mountain melting with the snow melting, with her tears are sort of destroying her. And then I guess another one is the reunion of Odysseus and Penelope, where the simile compares the situation. It seems as first unclear about who's being compared to somebody surviving a shipwreck, gradually crawling to land and so relieved to be alive. And so you think it's Odysseus who's this almost victim who's managed to survive, but actually that's what Penelope is. The explicit comparison is Penelope. And so I think it's something that Homeric narrative can do, is to sort of shift around through simile about what perspective are we looking through. And I guess another thing I just wanted to flag about, you said it's a husband who has been killed, but it seems to me that part of what's so striking about this passage, but this happens all over the place in Homer, is that it goes in this almost cinematic way, where it's not, this is a static depiction of, this is the Trojan horse at one moment in time, this is a woman crying at one moment in time. It's, here's the horse on the outside, they're debating, and now here the horse is inside, and now Odysseus is slaughtering everyone. The passage goes through time. Montagey. It's very montagey. And then with the second section of it, the same thing happens, right? That the woman is watching her husband as he's dying, and now he's dead, and now she's enslaved. And so it goes step by step through a whole experience rather than a sort of snapshot.
Yeah, kind of a supercut of that, a cutting together of a whole sequence in really rapid succession.
Mm-hmm.
Eisenstein would be pleased.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's such a huge text. Whenever I translate something and then I read it again like a week later or a month later, I see things that I wanted to change.
Yes.
Do you have that every time you read
every
this?
Time. Every time,
it's
yes.
I should have done that.
No, yes.
Especially if you're doing it bilingually, right? So you're going back and forth between the text, oh, damn.
Yes, totally. There are several things that I would like to change, yes.
What would you like to change in there?
I would like to establish the parallelism between the simile and the main narrative more clearly than I do. I mean, I think it's clear even in the translation that, so for instance, we didn't talk about how there's this sort of question of, are they going to hit the horse with spears and then they're going to hit the woman with spears? And because the Trojans failed in their projected violence against this inanimate object, then there's this violence against this woman and so many women. The parallelism of the cheeks of the woman and the cheeks of Odysseus, because I did line for line with the Odyssey, there were moments when I was sort of forced into kinds of compression that if I were to do it again, with the Odyssey, I would do what I did with the Iliad. I'd let myself have a few more lines and then I would do a complete rewrite and make a lot of changes.
Can you imagine getting a draft of a translation and then taking it on the road as a way of kind of stress testing it?
Yeah, taking it on tour.
Yes. Before you then record the album and
with your band.
Go back into the studio.
Of course, with your band.
It was my band, yes. I mean, so with the Odyssey, I sort of did a version of it by sort of summoning little groups of grad students, and I would read my draft in progress out loud. And I felt that the reading out loud was an essential part of the process. I mean, I would do a lot of reading out loud just to myself, but I hear differently if I'm reading out loud to other people. And then sort of thinking through, does this character seem to make sense? Which I sort of hear that differently if I'm trying to perform the character as opposed to just performing it on the page.
I think we would like to volunteer to be in the next focus group.
You can be in the group, yes, totally. That would be
Absolutely.
Great. Yes, please do, yes.
And
yes,
the band. We have to be the backup.
And the band,
yes.
Yes. Good.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of SideGig, and we want to say a warm thanks to our friend and colleague, Emily Wilson, for joining us today. Thank you
so much. It was fun.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
And also thank you to our technical backup team, Magda and Zach. You guys are great.
Thank you.